right, so let's talk about the beginning of chapter 4. I'd like to talk about the first 5 numbered sections. It's pages 49 to 52. Here is the first page of the outline that we have. And then I think when we're done with this, we'll jump ahead to the section 2 on real assents, some of the things he says about those before contrasting them with notional. He summarizes where he is in section 1 on the first page. One of the things that he mentions in the very first paragraph is that it is the concrete object of the real apprehension that commands the mind's attention. That which is concrete exerts a force and makes an impression on the mind which nothing abstract can rival. So for this reason, real apprehensions are stronger than notional apprehensions. We would presume also then real assents are stronger than notional assents. And this is the point he makes in the remainder of section 1 with regard to sight and scent. And the reason, we said this last time, the reason that some assents seem to be stronger is because of the greater vividness of their objects, not because the character of the assent itself is different. He notes here throughout also the close association between a thing and the apprehension of the thing. I think he's trying to disarm a technical objection that he needs to settle the question of whether it's the thing or the apprehension that's making the impression on our mind. His point, I take it here, is that these two things are so closely united that it's really a trivial question to try to separate them and assign a causal power to one or to the other. He says, I'm comfortable speaking about the apprehension of the thing doing the job of the thing doing the job of its apprehension. Those two come so closely together that it's not profitable for our understanding to try to separate them. Section 2, real apprehension is stronger than notional because things, which are its objects, are confessedly more impressive and effective than notions. We're back to the descriptive psychology here, the psychology of knowing. When we encounter things, we are struck more powerfully than we are by the notions or the ideas or the abstractions of things. And again, the variation in the strength of the assent, as we commonly speak, comes from, not from a gradation in assent, but from the different character of the objects. The real objects of assent accounts for the variability. He then makes a distinction between inference and assent, and I think this is where we should spend some time, because there's going to be a need, I think, for charts, like was suggested before, to do some diagramming here, to contrast assent from inference to see how they're connected to each other. We're familiar with inferences from critical thinking, from logic class. Assent is of a different character, and we have in the outline a couple of different points of contrast. So let me put some things up on the board here, and we can begin looking at how these are different from each other. We should consider the contrast between notional assent and inference. It's notional assent that will be sometimes confused with inference. Real assent is less likely to be confused with inference because it's dealing with real things and it has this vividness to it. But notional assent and inference both work on notional apprehensions. So here's a source of similarity. I have notional assent about notional apprehensions, and I have inferences about notional apprehensions, and yet these two are not the same. What are some of the differences between them? We have these in sections 3, 4, and 5. We know that assent by its nature is one and indivisible, and that by its very nature, inference varies by strength. So we have the binary on-off toggle switch for assent. Either we assent or we withhold and do not assent. But for inferences, we can speak of variation. He also says in section 4 that the assent apprehends propositions as things, whereas the inference apprehends propositions as notions. Let's try to unlock that. We know that as Newman describes it, a notion is more abstract than a thing. It has less of a grip upon the mind. He speaks of the notional proposition, the proposition grasped as notion by inference, as including the dependence of the thesis on the premises. So he notes that it involves this relatedness, and relationship is always an abstraction. So we have something abstract in our inferential grasp of things. This is the bottom of page 51, a very short section 4. We may call it then the normal state of inference to apprehend propositions as notions, the normal state of assent to apprehend propositions as things. An act of inference includes in its object the dependence of its thesis upon the premises, that is, upon a relation which is an abstraction. So here, it's because inference always grasps the conclusion, the thesis, as conditional, conditioned by the premises. Given that the premises are true, the conclusion is true. So the inference accepts the conclusion, The inference accepts the conclusion as conditionally true on the condition of the argument that leads to it. This conditionedness is a relation. Relation is abstract, not singular. He speaks of individuals as being the objects of these real assents. What's the contrasting point under notional assent? He says this assent is going to apprehend propositions as things, the reality of the thesis as a condition of its unconditionality. Tough to speak of a proposition as a thing. It seems like the kind of thing that would more easily lend itself to being a notion. Do you have any questions or examples that we might bring to this? Pause here. I've filled out this diagram at the bottom of the board.
How a proposition could be a notion.
Yeah.
Or how a proposition could be a thing.
Can be a thing. He gives the example of the bottom of page 50 in section 3. Thus, whereas no one could possibly confuse the real assent of a Christian to the fact of our Lord's crucifixion with a notional acceptance of it as a point of history on the part of the philosophical heathen. So we know those aren't going to be mistaken. The real assent to the crucifixion versus a sort of philosophical acceptance of a historical fact based upon the evidence available. Those are obviously different. Nevertheless, it would be easy to mistake the Stoics' notional assent, genuine though it might be, to the moral nobleness of the just man struggling in the storms of fate. Okay, so that's a notional assent, that's on this side here. For a mere act of inference resulting from the principles of the Stoical profession. Or again, an assent merely to the inferential necessity of the nobleness of that struggle. So here, a contrast between the notional assent of the Stoic. We don't want to mistake that for an inference by the Stoic. Can we unlock that? A little bit more. I'm sorry for the noise of the lawnmowers outside. That's unfortunate. What are the contrasting cases? Yes, sir.
Well, he seems at some level to be saying that the notional part, at least, comes from the nature of the Stoic and the way he thinks.
Yeah.
So if you're a committed Stoic, you think a certain way about reality, and therefore certain premises are going to be accepted because of the design of your way of viewing reality.
So perhaps this is a fact of the Stoics seeing reality in a certain way, appreciating with a notional assent. How does he say? The Stoics' notional assent, genuine to the moral nobleness of the just man. I see the just man struggling in the storms of fate. I grasp his nobility. I affirm it. I assent to it. as a notion. I'm just talking about the just man, the great man, generally, not about a particular
Yeah,
concrete case.
I think you could also say in modern circumstances that all people of goodwill would agree that justice is good. And that's not inferential, that's essentially an accepted part of the way you view the term justice.
Right.
And it's kind of a universal view. Now, once you start parsing it, there are plenty of differences that you can bring out about what is and what is not just. But
Right. There's a difference between seeing reality in a certain way, seeing the justice of the noble man, seeing the struggle of the just man as noble. I see it, I grasp it, I assent and affirm it, with saying, inferring from the rules of the Stoical system that such a man would be noble, right? Such people are noble. Why? Because the rules of the system require it. There's something conditional and more bloodless, it seems, about this, versus the Stoic genuinely sees reality, even in this notional fashion, sees and affirms and assents to the nobility of the struggling man. I think that's helpful. In a different context, Newman may be assuming more general familiarity with principles of Stoicism than people are likely to have today. But I think that's a good example, and it's right down to the question of how is notional assent different from an inference. We would be wrong to read the notional assent of the Stoic for he's just deducing from his system the necessary requirements of nobility, or from this situation he would call it noble in some sort of conditioned fashion. He's saying, no, it in fact is noble. Right? He's giving it as the real excuse me, the real thing. Yes?
So to make that inference,
Yeah.
The premises that you used to make that inference that good men are noble, they're not notions. Are they notions when you don't assent to them?
I have notions.
Yeah.
That I have notions that I apprehend notionally.
Yeah.
I can use them as material for an inference, which results in a conditioned conclusion, which is held in a certain fashion.
Okay.
But I can also grasp them and assent to them.
Okay.
So this seems to me, this is more the Stoic working out the necessary consequences of his principles. This is the Stoic, we might say, applying his principles and asserting the struggling man is noble. Just simplicity, right? Without conditions, without being linked up with inference. There's a difference between seeing and inferring or deducing. Not everything that we see. Some things we see directly and they have this vividness, even in the notional mode. Right? They have an immediacy to them. That's what I take him to be saying.
So that's more particular and that's more universal.
Well, this is always going to be abstract.
Okay.
Now, I think we have abstractions over here too, because these are necessarily abstract. But there's something concrete and immediate and real about the apprehension of the proposition as a thing. We treat the proposition here as though it were a thing. That's the difference here. The proposition here is itself conceived with an element of abstraction to it. Okay? Sure. The third point on the outline from section 5, the assent is most perfect and highest of its kind when it's exercised upon its propositions, which are apprehended as experiences and images, that is to say, as things. And the inference is most perfect and highest of its kind when exercised on propositions which are apprehended as notions, that is, as creations of the mind. So another difference, when we're working with inferences, it looks like we are working with objects of our own creation, things that we ourselves have made, ideas in our head. Here, there's still propositions, but they're treated as something more concrete, as the experiences, the images, the memories of things. This is what gives them the greater immediacy. Yes?
A creation of the mind becomes an experience or an image.
Yeah, this is why I want to look at the way in which we can convert one of these into another. Just want to make sure we get to this later today. So let me say one or two more words about cross-wiring these things, because he says something about that in the first sections. Then we'll jump ahead to this, because it should be obvious that we don't have to take our pick between these. We can exercise both assent and inference, but when we do that, we're exercising two different acts. And we want to see, how can I convert an inferential grasp of something, such as, struggle against fate is noble, would be noble, if someone were to do it, to a genuine impression and apprehension of the experience, the image, the imagination, the memory of the noble struggle. Because I can convert those to, this can lead to this, but equally well, the inferences are a necessary condition for many of the notional assents. So we have to apply them. So we'll look at the relation between them now, and I think also next class, because it's important. That's important. Okay. So that's coming up soon. Other questions?
I'm curious as to where like deja vu.
Deja vu.
Because it's an experience that's created by the mind previously. It creates an image within you.
I think if you're working with memory and experience, you're dealing with something on this side, it looks to me.
Okay.
Here, I think it's the conditionality that is really the telling thing. These are always held on the strength of something else. These are always linked up to, right? They have like a little gold chain off of them, linking them to their other conditions, whereas these don't. And so I think if you're dealing with deja vu as a set of uncanny experiences, like a feeling that I've been here before, et cetera, you're dealing with the experience. That tells me you're on this side. You're in assent at that point. There is something particularly bloodless and abstract about inference, it seems to me. When we do it, and we should do it, we need to do it. But when we're doing it, we're operating, we're grinding away at ideas in a way that it seems to me we're not when we're doing this kind of assent. Assent is a more kind of something you take ownership of, it seems to me. All right. Something that's not in the outline. Actually, it comes up in the paradoxes at the very bottom of the first page of the outline for those of you who have it. Let's think about the relation between assent and inference and their objects. It's funny you should have mentioned charts earlier, because this is exactly what I was doing sort of in the margin of my making little visual representations. Let's think about assent and inference and their objects. It should be obvious that the main way these things work is that I can apply assent to real things. It's either real assent if it applies to real things, or if it is assent applied to notions taken as things, then it would be notional assent. But I'll call that, it's a type of thing over here, plainly in the realm of assent. Over here, I can apply inferences to notions, and I can achieve the kind of conditional grasp of something notionally through means of inference. But he does say at the end of this opening sections that these can actually also be cross-wired, right? We can apply inferences to real things. We don't do that very often because the real things are singular rather than abstract. But when we do, what we often end up with, he says, conjectures and presentiments. This is the middle of page 52 in section 5. An act of inference indeed may be made with either of these modes of apprehension. So may an act of assent. When inferences are exercised on things, they tend to be conjectures and presentiments without logical force. So when we begin trying to apply the tools of inference to real things, we end up with things that lack the logical force which inference is trying to give us. And when we try to apply assent to mere notions, we end up more often than not, he says, with mere assertions without any personal hold on them on the part of those who make them. inferences applied to real things often, not always perhaps, but often, will lack logical force. Assent applied to notions here can end up with mere assertions that lack the personal conviction that goes with assent. So it is possible to cross-wire these. This leads to these two paradoxes at the bottom of the outline. Where inference is clearest, assent may be least forcible. So in dealing with these. Seems to be a paradox because we would associate strength of inference with strength of assent. And yet, if inference and assent actually have the character that Newman is telling us they have, we would expect this would be the case, in fact. The stronger your inferential grasp, the stronger I grasp something as an inference is following from these premises, from these conditions, the weaker I would find my assent to it to be, precisely because I'm grasping it in this conditional way through the inference, which is why the question that Zachary asked about converting inferences to assents will be very important. In the same way, applying inferences here, it's the other paradox, where assent is most intense, inference may be the least distinct. Okay. So here we may have precisely where my assent is the strongest, where I give my most powerful unconditional yes to a proposition, that may be the place where my inference is less clear and less distinct and less vividly worked out. Already the beginning of a way of describing the religious mind starting to emerge. If these are the rules of the game, if this is the character of inference, this is the character of assent, then these two paradoxes give us some insight into what to expect of their combination. We would see, thinking maybe of Pascal here, right? What does Pascal write about? Pascal writes about the need to assent to the existence of God on the strength of an argument that looks inferentially perhaps quite weak, you might say. It's not actually the certainty. People don't commit to or assent to the belief in God, to the existence of God, on the strength of the absolute certitudes of the deductive arguments of the philosophers. So maybe there's something going on here. This could actually would then apply maybe to a psychology of conversion. Dozie, Michael, Tommy.
So when he talks about inference, is this different from when in logic he taught us about the inferential link between premises and
I think it's exactly the same thing that he means by the inferential link. Yeah, I think we're talking about deducing propositions from other propositions.
Okay.
It's interesting you mentioned Pascal because at the same point that, and I think that's right, I think that's exactly what he did. He made a relatively weak inferential argument and then called for assent, but then he has sewn into the breast pocket of his coat that, which seems to me to be the purest form of what Newman's trying to get at.
It's with Pascal, there's this kind of powerful, he's almost like, it's an existential argument in a sense. It's a call for commitment. When you analyze it, there's all sorts of atheist philosophers out there who will analyze Pascal's wager and expose to you the reasons it won't work. There's an analogous Muhammad's wager that you certainly wouldn't accept, et cetera, et cetera. It's not about the inference, in a sense. It's about, now we have a name for it. And maybe Newman gives us the vocabulary to talk about assent in a way that makes the psychology of belief different from simply having well-grounded or poorly grounded arguments for your beliefs. And if you've ever encountered a sort of street atheist, right, what's your proof for the resurrection? Or what's your good argument? What's your argument for your belief in the resurrection? You have no good argument. You're an irrational, borderline dangerous person. Because you form your core beliefs around things that you admit you have no good argument for. So there's much more here to say about this, but the beginning of this is to see the distinction between assent and inference, and then to talk next about transitioning from one to the other. Tommy, you had a hand up? And Chris, did you?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tommy. Then Chris.
Yeah, I'm wondering what the relationship is between the this idea of assenting to notion, which creates an assertion without any personal hold. Like I know what he means, but I'm trying to relate that to a discussion we've had in contemporary on like fanaticism and ideology.
Interesting.
And I'm wondering if assent to notions is ideological or if there's something else going on, if that doesn't.
Right, I don't think I have time to apply that fully to here, but interesting question would be, does the ideologue or the fanatic, is that a person who's assented too much, or is it a person who's inferred too much?
Yeah,
And I'm tempted to say, there's a sort of play for fanaticism on the side of of inference, that I've deduced that property is theft, or I've deduced that, such and such must be the case. Then the moral consequences follow from it, but perhaps in a way, the mark of the ideologue for me is disconnection from reality, or is a sort of violent opposition to the real, to the way things are, or more charitably, a desire to fundamentally alter the way things are. This is the revolutionary impulse. But if it comes from a deduction, right, family life should be this way because of these principles of equality that I've deduced are the correct ones, there's the danger of a fanaticism there. It can take many, many different forms. Whether you can have a fanatic who just assents too much, this is your sort of Hollywood villain, right? The one who believes anything without leaving a trap door open for I might be refuted. I think that's seems to me less likely.
Actually, well, yeah. All right, now, sorry, I'm thinking through what you were saying. Could you say the fanatic assents to almost like notional notions? So like I assent to the notion
Yeah.
that, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus here, that the Green Party is right on everything.
What? Okay.
So not even without assenting to, that's not really throwing out the bus, but I'm just trying to avoid, unless you're anyone's guard, yeah.
No, I see what you mean. I think we
You know what I'm saying?
Let's keep this
Yeah.
vocabulary going. I
Yeah.
think there may be some
Yeah,
good
yeah, so
discussions
you
of this
assent-
next
yeah.
week as well.
Yeah, so you assent, rather than even assenting to a notion,
Mhm.
right, rather than even assenting to like, carbon caps are a necessary thing, which that's notional even before you get to the real debate.
Yeah.
You're just assenting to like, well, this person's notions are all correct. That's a notion in itself.
You could get very, very meta
Yeah,
very quickly.
yeah, assenting to notions of notions.
It could be applying assent where assent's not
Yeah.
called for,
Yeah.
but we want to be careful with this because the psychology here is rather complex.
Yeah.
It's not just just these two columns, but this is one way of representing some of the wiring diagram, it seems to me, for belief formation and holding beliefs. Chris?
So, I guess this whole thing kind of strikes me as a bit emotivist.
How do you think so?
I guess I'm wondering how this would say compare to fides et ratio, and the whole idea that there's this strong relationship between faith and reason.
Well, we haven't gotten to religious categories yet, so I haven't gotten to faith, right, and to reason. Reason, there's a kind of reason that plays a role in inference. Inference is obviously an act of reasoning. But I think the objects of faith can be either real or notional. I've already referred to the distinction between religion and theology. He mentions the distinction between the assent to the resurrection versus a sort of notional appreciation for the existence of Jesus of Nazareth as a historical figure based upon the available evidence. So there's something notional about the one, something real about the other. There's a way in which the inference can't overturn by itself, or not easily, the apprehension of the real. The emotivism I'm not seeing yet, but the emotions are going to be connected with it. But do you want to fill that out at all, or should we save it for next week?
As I don't really see why you would assent to something if you don't really have darn good rational reasons for it.
Okay. Well, if assent is this relation to the real, that can come through sensation, it can come through experience. There's going to be a sort of vividness coming to the mind. Let's talk about the formation of assents as we go forward through the rest of the parts of the book we're going to be reading.
Okay.
So I think that's a good point here. I mean, how do I form my beliefs, if not on the basis of inferences? Yeah. How do I form a sense? How do assents come to be what they are? We'll leave that as an open question for now, because we need to resolve that before we finish with treating Newman. Okay. It's about 5 minutes left. Yes.
So, what is the process? Like, where does a person lie if they have an assertion that they're making? what is the true assertion, but then they have no way to actually prove that yet.
Mhm.
Like somebody within science who like is very adamant about something being a particular way,
Mhm.
and they can't prove it. But then everybody else is like, no, it doesn't work that way. Like
Well,
bumblebees don't fly.
It could be an inference, it could be a notion that's not backed up by a sufficient inference yet.
Okay.
Or it could be an assent. We're looking at the psychology of the mind of the person holding it. If they assent to it, there's a yes saying that's absolute and unconditional. Right? That's easy. It's easy to see that in the case of religious belief. People say yes unconditionally to some central truth of their religion. Or they might be sort of thinking their way toward a conversion. They've come to some deductions about the nature of the church and the nature of apostolic succession, but they haven't felt it yet. The emotions come in here as well. They haven't engaged with it on the real level yet. It looks like we're not going to get today to talk much about the conversion of inferences to assents. Yes, sir.
Does this have to do largely with the difference between like your brain and your heart? Because like inferences are largely an intellectual activity.
Yeah.
But sometimes even like, you know, a valid intellectual logical proof doesn't actually convince somebody. Because you don't like feel it. Does that have something to do with that?
We could say it involves the heart, say it involves the whole man or the whole intellect, though. I want to say this is an act of the intellect. So I don't know if the heart's going to be a useful category. There's some obvious connections with Pascal. I mean, I'm not the first one to notice them. T.S. Eliot puts Newman alongside Pascal as people who can speak to the character of a modern believer. What I've been interested in establishing today is that we can speak of assent as a different type of act from inference. So when people challenge your assents on the grounds that they're not proper inferences, the right response is to say, that's not what assent is. Assent's related to inference in a way that I haven't fully sketched out yet. But we'll take that up next time, I think. Okay. So maybe we can look at the question whether we call this the heart or the whole person. There's certainly something more adamant and unconditioned and life-changing about, especially real assents in the realm of religion, than there is about theological changes, where I might say, I used to believe in this particular theological doctrine and now I'm doubtful about it. The strength of the inference upon which I hold it is weaker now because I read this article or I had this challenge or I thought through, I realized an objection hadn't been adequately dealt with. That's one type of thing. This is a different type of thing. So once we separate them in our vocabulary, we can begin talking about how they're connected or not connected and how they might lead to or undermine each other. Yes, sir.
This is probably a conversation for another class, but I guess the idea of first principles,
Mhm.
the assenting to first principles,
Yeah.
rather than referring to the
Right. That's exactly what Pascal is doing with the heart, where he says the heart intuits first principles. He doesn't use that language, but the heart grasps first principles. You can't ask the heart to give you a demonstration of first principles any more than you could ask the rational mind to give an argument for, or to give an. You can't expect the heart to grasp deductive conclusions any more than you can expect the intellect, the rational, calculative mind, to give an argument in favor of first principles. They're just of different orders. Newman doesn't use the language of orders, but I've used it here a couple of times, so it seems to be correct. There's two different kinds of things going on in our minds when we know these things.